Welcome to the Miniatures Paintbrush. Today we're going to paint up Buzzy from Reaper Miniature Bones Kickstarter 3.
Wow.
Hello there, friends. Today we're going to paint up Buzzy from the Reaper Bones Miniature Collection line, Kickstarter 3. This time I'm going to limit my color palette. A lot of the time I go all over the place when it comes to color. I've decided that, it was a little bit too much. So I'm going to scale it back. So the first thing I'm going to do is starting to build up the color, but before that, I primed this miniature using Rust-Oleum camouflage paints. I like their paint line. They're ultra flat, which I really like ultra flat. I like to paint in ultra flat colors. And people say you don't have to paint prime Reaper Bones miniatures, but you do have to wash them vigorously with soap. I've had mixed results with this. There have been times where I washed things vigorously with soap and then primed it with a rattle can, the same rattle can that I use for other minis in the line. And some minis, they don't cure fully, and the other ones do. So I don't know what the scenario is with that. I do know that I actually prime the bendy or more bendy items as in terrain, and they seem to not fully cure. Again, with the same exact paint I would use to prime these. Okay, now what I'm doing here is I'm building in the colors with the airbrush. Most of these tutorials that I do employ airbrush as well as paintbrush for details. But getting that great base coat, putting in a lot of the shadows to begin with, as guiding principles, using airbrush is a time saver and, in my opinion, the best route to do. If you are thinking about painting many miniatures in this hobby, it's worth investing into an airbrush. Now, there are many airbrushes out there. A couple of brands. Badger puts out a brand. I'm using a Badger Renegade. I also have an Iowata. The CS is best for miniature painting. However, I have a Trigger side loader that I received for my birthday. It was a Neo, and it was really, really great. Easy to paint for very, very large surfaces. Okay, now that I have the black in, I'm going to hit it with a little heavy sienna from Game Colors. It's extra opaque. I do like extra opaque because you can thin it way, way down and it still has that opacity to cover. And having that base coat of the black really brings out that darker brown from the sienna. It changes the color since it's translucent. Now you may notice that I'm not using any Game Air line, that I'm using Game Color line. And that's true. It's a little different from what a lot of people use. And the reason why it's a bit different from what a lot of people use is because while I have all these Game Color lines, my local store was actually selling out and not carrying Vallejo Game Color anymore. I guess to save space in their game store. So, I picked it up. I picked up every last one that they had. And in doing so, they gave me the rack that came with it as well. So, since I have all these game colors, I'm not in a hurry to buy new sets of paint. Although, I do have to say, the full line from War Colors is very tempting, as is Scale 75, their regular scale color, as well as their fantasy and game line color. And I'm really curious as to how those colors, how they interact with these other brands, with Vallejo and other things. And I'm sure there's not going to be too much of a problem. Now, the one danger you need to watch out for these paints are that if you thin it down too thin, you're going to get a glossy sheen to it, and that may be something you don't want when you thin it down too far. If you're going to thin it down that far, I recommend using some medium. I'm using Airbrush Fluid, which is really good, and it's from Vallejo. I picked that up. I was watching this other YouTuber, Kenny Boucher, from Next Level Painting, and he uses Fluid, Airbrush Fluid. So I wanted to try it out, and so far I had very good results. I take the Airbrush Fluid, one drop, and then I put more water in there to dilute it, and it seems to work out great. Okay, time to build up the next color in the line. It's a bit lighter color, it's a bit of bone. And I didn't want to go straight white here because I'm going to go white in a bit. So building up that bone color for the second tier of feathers. I did want a transition, and it doesn't have to really be perfect. What I did before I started painting this is to look up references of vultures, and I saw a couple that I really liked. And what I do is I take my cell phone while looking these things up. I simply used search engine. Google was handy in images, and I looked it up. Sometimes I go on to Pinterest. I also get inspiration, but mainly use Google search, and then clicked onto the images. And I wanted to sort of replicate that, or get at least close to it. I know this is a fantasy miniature, and realism isn't something a lot of people go for. But for when it comes to bones, because they really just want a tabletop piece for the game night. Me, I kind of like to push it. I like to go a little above tabletop, and that is where my painting, because I have so many things to paint, especially with Reaper Bones, a little bit above tabletop is the quality that I like to go for. So there I am blending it. I do like it. Again, modeling that color that I got from the picture, and as best as I can with the colors that I have. And if you're starting painting, I wouldn't go for the perfect mini every single time, especially when you're starting, because first, there's no such thing as perfect, and you can always push it a little further in any direction. And secondly, it's your first miniature. Give yourself a break. My first miniature was horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. So, in fact, I burnt it. I melted the figure. I completely destroyed it. It was so hideous. No one should bear eyes upon the tragedy that mini is. So remember that if you're going to do the overcoat, you would want to do the underside as well, which kind of gets tricky for the camera angle. So I do apologize if the pill bottle's in the way, but it'll get out of the way in a hurry. As I'm coming up this other wing, it should anyway. So I do apologize for that. But the transition on the airbrush on the other side was a little tougher, so a lot of the lighter color got onto the darker heavy sienna that I had put on underneath, so that's going to cause for me touching up later on. But that's okay. Touching up a darker color is a lot easier than touching up a lighter color when you already have a dark base, so I really wasn't too worried about it at all. So I did a little bit of research for vultures as well, and I thought a lot of things here was interesting. There are New World vultures and Old World vultures, and I had no idea that there was two classifications like that. In fact, there are many breeds, many breeds of vultures. Now, you do see vultures in the African plains as well as heard in the desert. And vultures are found in actually every continent except for Australia and Antarctica, which I found was very interesting indeed. They're huge. They are huge. And most of them have bald heads, devoid of feathers. Historically, it was believed that they, kept the head clean while feeding, and that's why they have bald heads. The bare skin may play a important role on regulating their temperature, it is found. Okay, so the next color here is a bone white, which I'm going right here on the top with, and just getting that yellow bone color. I don't want to go all the way white because if I do, you can't really highlight white, so I wanted to go a different color, then build that up. And there are various points where I got dry tip. I think I got a little bit of dry tip there. Now, when you're working with an airbrush, dry tip is a thing. So after a while, the paint's going to dry on the tip. It's exactly what you can imagine. The paint is going to dry on the tip of the airbrush, and you have to clean it off. Now, what I use for that is a Q-tip. I take a Q-tip and I just rub the paint right off the needle, being gentle because the needle is the most sensitive part of your airbrush. You don't want to bend that, and they're pretty expensive to replace, so just please be careful. Now when I do this, I thin these colors way down in order to gradually build up that white and that bone white. And I also, in thinning that down, I also lowered the PSI of the airbrush to a controllable level. I think I went down to 11 PSI on this one, to 12 PSI or something like that, around there. And it's only because when I want to work in small areas and just do highlight tips, I lower the PSI down. I never lower it below 10 usually. So because if you lower it down too much, the more paint buildup will happen on the tip, and it'll just become very frustrating to work with the airbrush. In fact, in general, when you lower down the pressure, there's more gook that collects at the tip of the airbrush. So keep that in mind when you're painting yours. So the interesting thing about vultures is feeding. I mean, that's what everybody thinks about it. But it's interesting that I found out while doing research on vultures that vultures rarely attack healthy animals, and many kill the wounded or sick. So they don't really go hunting, more than just scavenging. And if they scavenge something or find something that just recently died or is dying, and their hide is too thick to break open, they wait for a larger scavenger to come to eat first, and then they'll just feast on whatever's left over. As you can imagine, these birds are associated with dying things and death. I mean, even in this miniature, it's on top of a gravestone. And the reason for that, historically, is that you can definitely see vast numbers, or you usually could see vast numbers on battlefields. And they gorge themselves when prey is abundant. So they actually took dead human soldiers, and that was their prey, and they feast upon that. So you see a field of dead soldiers and vultures just having their way at it. The association isn't too hard to imagine. Oh, goodness. So vultures are scavengers, especially in like hot regions where food is very, very scarce. They actually adapted to that with their eyes, being able to spot the huge wingspan so they can cover longer distances. And they're huge, huge, huge birds. It's actually scary. I never want to see one in person because that would frighten me, terrify me actually. But there are so many species of vultures. I never knew there were so many. There were so many. So after a bit, if I wanted to put some hot spots on there, I would mix bone white with a white, 1-to-1 ratio, just to create some hot spots in certain areas. And that's all that I did with this one right here. Remember, never going fully white because I didn't want to go, I didn't want to be able to try to highlight the white. It's impossible to highlight white. So keep that in mind when you're painting miniatures. I think the transition came out pretty well. I do like the colors. I was a little hesitant on using which colors and what they would look like on the Mini, so I just went for it and see what happened. I said if I don't like it, I could always paint over it. But again, I do need to touch up the bottom of those wings there, because it I kind of got a little bit carried away with that. But the top came out pretty well. I'm pretty happy for it. For a bit of a speed paint, 1, 2, 3. It was great, and these Bones miniatures, I enjoy speed painting them and trying to get faster with miniature painting in general. In miniature painting, the more you paint, the quicker you get in general, and to the desired effect. So I work on new techniques and pushing myself and taking my time and taking months to do one miniature and really understanding and grasping what the concepts are. All right, time for some red. Carbine Crimson, actually. Again, very, very much diluted and through an airbrush. A lot of people say, "Ooh, well, you can't use it through an airbrush," but because it doesn't work. But yeah, it does. Yes, it does. Again, sorry, apologize for the angle here, but I'll show you in just a moment how it builds up and how it actually does work through your airbrush. Not to paint because there is a translucent opacity, but to tint lightly, ever so lightly. So this is all about subtlety here and building up those transitions. I love, love, love shades for that, as well as inks. Inks have a more dramatic, because they're highly pigmented, more dramatic transition, very, very watered down as well. So if you want like extra opacity, go for an ink when airbrushing. But shades definitely work, and it's not just shades from Games Workshop, shades from the Army Painter as well. I've tried a couple so far. They're strong tone and they're flesh wash, and it had a very, very good effect with it. And really, it does build up that transition. If you see, it looks like this is a little bit of leftover blood. Now, I didn't want to go realism when it came to the blood as much. I kind of wanted to go because I saw in the picture that this vulture actually had like a little red patch underneath his neck and a little bit on his, well, I put the thing on his beak. I just thought it would be cool. But a little bit on his neck, and I want to replicate that. So there you go. I just replicated that. So you can look for it and think it's blood or dry blood, but not really. I didn't go for the blood effects. I do have blood effects paint as well as Tamiya's clear red. Oh, time to dry brush some white. Tamiya's clear red, which I use for blood effects, and this is not what I was going for. Okay, so time for dry brushing. Now, dry brushing, if you go to dry brush, use a soft brush. Right there, I'm using a Nicole brush, and I think I got those at AC Moore. If not, it was Hobby Lobby. It was one of those two stores, definitely, because they're both around the area. And it was an incredibly soft brush. Now, one of the things when dry brushing, a lot of people go too heavy with the dry brush. Don't. I mean, keep flicking that or taking off the paint from the brush. First, you dip it into like one drop of paint, and then you whisk it away on a drier surface until you don't see any more paint. When you don't see any more paint, you may wick it up just a little bit more and then go for the dry brush. This is not a once and done kind of thing when it comes to dry brush. You need to build this up, because if you once and done it, the chances of you putting streaks onto a finish is very high, and getting an undesired result is very high and you being unhappy. Now, what I'm doing with the feathers is I'm going against the grain. Yes, and if you go against the grain, it'll pick up all the edges, and that's exactly what I want. So the directionality when dry brushing onto feathers is really important. Always go against the grain. I hear when you're shaving, you're not supposed to go against the grain. I do after I shave with the grain, and it doesn't get everything. So I go against the grain, and then it gets everything. So essentially, I shave twice every time. So you see how little paint. Now, I never re-dipped my brush. One pass, and this is after I dipped it into the paint and I took out all the stuff, and I didn't see any more, and that's when I did it. That's when I started dry brushing. And again, looking at the directionality is super important. And it's just catching the edges. Basically, it's an edge highlight without edge highlighting at this point. And I was going to edge highlight every single one of these feathers, but I reminded myself this is a speed paint. Plus, it's a pretty good effect here. I mean, it came out pretty well. Later on, I unify everything by hitting a shade, I think it's Agrax Earth Shade, from a very far distance and gently covering all the areas just to smooth out the transitions throughout and smooth out these dry brushing. And I usually do that towards the end of a miniature. I'll just take a shade and from a very far distance mist it on the entire model, and it just kind of unifies everything subtly, very, very subtly. Okay. The underside was a little tricky. Again, the pill bottle kind of getting in the way with these, but not too bad. As you can see, I actually did get to him, so not bad. And I dry brushed the entire miniature because there's a lot of feathers in there. So do not dry brush the head or anything like that. Again, I'm using white for the highlights. White is definitely the color. Oops. Definitely the color. So I do like to use Vallejo paints, and as I mentioned earlier, so I just kind of wanted to look through and talk a little bit about the paint that I use, and featuring this paint in particular. I'm using Game Color here, and just as a brief recap, if you're not familiar with Vallejo paints, now Game Color is a special selection of fine water-based acrylic colors manufactured with a special resin and pigments, permanent pigments for miniatures, figures, and fantasy war games. It's actually designed for this purpose. It's a compact range with and especially developed to contain all frequencies used colors in fantasy figures, so they really try to guesstimate. Here's some Minotaur concrete slab. And what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to paint the tombstone. And just slowly bringing that color from the bottom. And I'm going to leave the top greens, because I do like that moldy look on the top of it, as if this has been rained on quite a bit. So I don't get overzealous with the gray, but I painted it gray enough that the eye thinks it's all gray without painting the entire thing, which is cool how to trick your eye like that. So plus, it gives a nice transition into that green subtly to the top. And you just make sure that you dilute the paint to do that. So these paints are highly pigmented and waterproof when dry. Now, if you create an error immediately with water or a small amount of alcohol you can actually take off the error. Be careful with the alcohol, it'll strip everything. So after a while, so you don't want to rub it in there, but it's just a light pass of alcohol will take out the paint if you get a little overzealous and make a mistake with these. So you can actually fix your mistakes using these things. But sometimes I use my spit. Sometimes I use two brushes in my hand. In one hand, I just use spit and just use it like an eraser. So if you're going to make a mistake, you can always take it off. Now it's time for the eyes, and I do want to spend a little bit of time on here for the eyes just to show you how I do it. And it's all about technique. It's all about bracing my hand. See how comfortable that pill bottle is laying in one of my hands, and on the other side, I'm actually leaning my hand onto the pill bottle, my pinky, just to brace it, so this way my hand doesn't shake and I limit my movement. And I'm slowly bringing up this eye. Okay, and when I saw it in the picture that I used for reference, that had like a amber sort of eye, so I was going for an amber kind of color first, and then I hit it with a ink, and then I hit it with a Micron pen to dot the pupil. And I do go a little overzealous with this, and I go a little bit over, and that's just fine. All I did was paint over it with the mid-tone, and it kind of erased the problem that I had. And that's another thing to do if you make a mistake. You can always go back and hit it with a mid-tone, and your eye will register it as if it wasn't a mistake at all. So, speaking about game colors, what I'm using now, they're extra opaque. They're actually 60 extra opaque. And then you want to think, well, I thought you're supposed to thin down your paints and use translucency. Yeah, most of the time you do. But sometimes you do want to cover your paint and you want it to you want to build it up in stages. Thinning down extra opaque is the way to go. Some Agrax Earth shade here. Just to get... Now, what I did was I usually I'm sorry, shade the areas around the miniature first, and then I would hit the pupils and stuff like that. But I did it in reverse order here. Now what I wanted to do, the color that I used for the eye was a little bit too much. So I did want to darken up that color, and in darkening up that color, the shade is perfect. The Agrax Earth shade is perfect to give it an amber tone. So going from that light brown to that amber tone. So hitting it with the amber color and then going over with the Agrax Earth shade to shade down the eye and actually get it to more amber color was perfect in this scenario and suited my needs perfectly. And sometimes you need to do that in reverse order. Sometimes you need to think about or plan ahead and say, okay, so I'm going to shade this down. When? What's the process looks like? When you look at a miniature, you kind of like try to break it apart and say, okay, so how'd you do that? And how'd you do that? What's the layer? What's the next step? You know, how do I replicate that? And the thing about miniature painting, you can replicate it quite easily. If you look at somebody paint like me, there are so many other artists out there. And a lot of the artists are really, really talented miniature painters. And, you know, a lot of them look at other and use references from other incredible painters, and that's how they get to their point. That and a whole bunch of practice. And how do you practice? You get a whole bunch of minis. I have a whole bunch of minis, so there you go. Okay, using some gaming sepia right now, and I just want to dot the eye. Now, it's very tricky to do with inks, but they're so opaque that I just wanted to put a droplet right in the middle of the eye. Actually a little bit facing forward to the tip of the nose, so it looks like it's looking ahead and not just, you know, generally out into nothing. So the extra opaque, they're about 16 in total, and they have especially matte and opaque coating, which covers all primer and base colors with, they say, with one application. But, and again, I thin these down and you have less applications. You know, they say you put, like, you thin down and have a couple of thin coats. Well, you know, usually by the second application, the second coat, you're good. So 2 thin coats is all you kind of need. I think in that sense, the GWs are all extra opaque, because I keep on hearing Duncan from Warhammer TV say use 2 thin coats, and that seems about appropriate for the extra opaque paints that I have. So, interesting. Of course, you have washes and inks, which I use as well in this line, and used for shadows and application of colors and layers. When applied over base coat, they enter the folds and grooves of the figures, instantly brings forth features. We can use mix with regular colors or with mediums, and I do that sometimes. I mix the actual ink with the regular color to change the tone of the color. Really easy, because the inks have a medium in them, and it can be used as an actual medium to tint your colors. So these are 17mm bottles, and it has an eyedropper tip. I do find some of the eyedropper tips that they come with are cracked, and the paint gets all over the place. Now, Scale 75 does this thing that I like, and that is the tips are sealed until you break the seal. And I usually take a little nail and dive it in there and break the seal myself. And this way, I have never seen a Scale 75 tip crack, and then the paint gets all over the place every time you open it up. And, you know, that's just a pain for everybody involved. You kind of want to not do that. Okay, so this is an example. I took that brown sienna, and I used the ink as a mix to be able to paint the nose bit right there. And it definitely helped tone down the dark sienna. And I put them both on my wet palette. It's for easier I guess, use. Plus, when using a wet palette, my paints don't dry; they stay the same consistency. So that's really important for me when I'm using any kind of paint. I want the same consistency. Now, when it comes to Vallejo, you have Vallejo model color as well. I use model color. It's basically for a if you've never heard of model color before. They have most of the range. In fact, I think Vallejo started miniature colors by using their model colors. And model colors teams has 223 colors. So it's an extensive assortment of mediums and washes designed especially for miniature and model painting. The colors have been chosen with the advice of the best model painters, so they've gotten a lot of feedback from model. They literally listen to the community. Again, this is the sienna with the ink wash that I'm putting onto the nose to get opacity. So they do have metallic paint in there, but I do like the model metallic airline paints for the airbrush. They are so finely pigmented. So they have model color and model model color, different kind of metallics. One that I do like is that blue steel, blue gun steel. Yeah, that's pretty cool. But you can actually see the metal flakes, and when you use the um, model air line, when it comes to model metal colors, and it's in a larger container, the pigment is so finely ground down, you really don't see the metal flakes as much as you see it with anything else. And huge metal flakes on a small figure, it looks unrealistic. If you do have those model color metallics, they're generally for very large items, they're not so bad. But for miniatures, yeah, definitely higher pigmented. Okay, time for some white and some bone white. So it's an equal mix. I'm just getting through. That creates the mid-tone. So here I am. I'm gonna just like fix up some mistakes that had dried and really go to town with this. Again, wet palettes are so important. In my opinion, I always use a wet palette because it's just so much easier. So model color is water-based, just like all acrylics here. And it can adhere to metal as well as plastic. So if you have a metal miniature, it's so easy to do that. And also, just like with the game air, a little bit of alcohol if you make a mistake. And these, they're not glossy. They're very matte paint, which I do like. Again, I use matte paint. Now these colors, they are dried to the touch within minutes. The water content keeps evaporating and the paint does not acquire its true permanence until several weeks after application, which is interesting. I do notice that after I paint the miniature and put it in my case, it just seems to change color. It seems to be a little more cooler. I'm not in cool colors as far as blues and stuff like that, but cooler as in like the colors settle and they look cool. I noticed that. So like the day after I finish painting, it's like, oh, it's all right. But after a week, I'm like, oh man, that's pretty cool. So, yep, these paints actually take a long time to dry, so it's sitting on a shelf is actually helpful. All right, time to go for red again. Switching colors rather quickly. I'm not doing too many transitions from one color to the next. I was on a roll, so I kind of wanted to get to it. And what I'm going to do is going to bring out the color of the beak and just try to make it a little darker there. Yep. and slowly bringing up the transitions. This is what you need to do. It's all about the subtlety when you're bringing things like that in, and people are going to notice the beak. So I wanted to take extra time on it. I wanted to really make it pop. And red is like the color or the frequency of color that traverses more distance. That's why a red light, or they use it in red lights when you're driving, because it reaches. Excuse me, because it reaches the furthest distance, which makes it easier to see. And I wanted it to pop. I do have a lot of like dull colors, so I didn't want it to like really not pop. Now, if you look at the wings, they're a little reflective there, and that happens if you thin down any paint too much. It just becomes glossy. So be careful with that. And what I say to that is that just change a medium, use a glaze medium, and that'll get rid of that. And if it starts coming out glossy for you, use a gloss medium. Use a. You could either use a matte medium, or you can use a glaze medium, or even a thinning medium, and they would all work to cut down on that sheen that you have with that. And that's just classical when you thin it down too much. There's a fine line. You want to thin it down, but not how much is too much. The wind is pretty fierce this morning. I can hear it in the background. You probably can't hear it, which is good. You don't want to hear a whole bunch of wind going on, but it's a little scary sometimes. So here I am just highlighting, and again, white is the color I go for here. And the reason why I go for white is because since I have these bone white on top, the white is the natural choice when it comes to highlighting. I do it under the eyes. I'm thinking about where the light is starting to catch, and I just just a little bit here and there. Very small strokes, very little paint, a little bit of edge highlighting when I can, just to touch up. And that's all I do. It's really important not to overdo your painting, and don't go a little too crazy with it. It's just creating a little blend there with the white. There's barely enough paint on there. So there you go. I'm just gonna refill it there. Refill my brush and slowly tip things off. I think eventually I get to the tip of the nose, or have I done it already? I think I did. Yeah. And just cleaning up the nose area right here, it was really important to go back and forth, and I think it came out pretty well. There it is, the red. And this is what I do with miniatures sometimes. I kind of just look at it, and see where it needs a touch up here and a touch up there, and I just keep playing with it. Time to do the nails. I'm not going to manicure this bad boy. It needs its talons to rip open flesh and stuff when it starts eating. So I'm going to hit it with some white, and then from the white, I take a shade of that. I was thinking I could have made it gory at this point, but I kind of didn't want to. Its name is Buzzy. It didn't seem too menacing, so I kind of want to make it like cute or cutesy. That's what I was going for personally. But if you have this figure and you want to paint it gory, I say go for it. Go for it. A little bit of browns, a little bit of dry blood effects from Game Color, a little bit of that clear from Tamiya, the red clear from Tamiya, or blood from Blood God. That is the color. And from Citadel Games Workshop. And so, doing that, you can do that and make it gory if you want to. But I'm trying to make this a little cute, little turkey-like. So I was going for it. And, it wasn't too much trouble painting these. Again, edge highlighting, leaving the shadows and the recesses, using the edge of my brush instead of the tip of my brush just to get the line itself, which is so much easier to edge highlight than it is to use the tip of the brush, because the tip of the brush can go either left or right, and you could have adverse effects. So be careful and be conscious of how you're moving the brush around. It does make a difference. And again, building it up to thin coats with that edge highlight. Not too worried about the details because I know I'm covering it. I don't want to get it on the tombstone, so I do be careful. I am careful about that. And if you have this miniature and you're painting up, please do be careful about getting it on the tombstone if you're at this stage or this step. If you want to be at this stage. Again, all my tutorials aren't the way to do it. I don't even claim to know the way to be able to do these things. But I do paint it to, I think, a decent standard, above tabletop, above that. And I think it looks great on the tabletop, actually. And yeah, so if you want to follow these steps, step by step, I do appreciate it, and I am honored that you would be able to do it, but I'm just letting you know how I do it and how it works out for me. I'm showing you how it works out for me. So quickly, I'm just going over back and forth, just picking up this little bit of habit of going back and forth, details, beating up my brush a little bit, but you know, that works to unify the colors a little bit. Alright, time to redip my brush. And I'm going for an ink color here, and what I'm doing here is I am just trying to build in some shadows or some pre-shading inside the ears. I do go for a shade underneath the well, where the gap of the mouth is, but before that I do want to just very, very, very subtly shade his cheeks, a little bit of that brown. And that's all I do, and there's very little paint in there, and you can see it. It's all about the subtleties. Sometimes the eyes pick up on the subtleties, and they actually don't pick up on it, but it just registers in the back of their mind and say, that's nice. I don't know why it's nice, but it's pretty nice, you know. So that's pretty cool that it does that as well. And definitely have effects there. I do want to say that building up these colors, building up these colors in a gradual transition is the way to go. Alright, time for the Micron Pen. I'm using a 0.05 or 0.005 point, which is tiny. I love Micron pens. I have 4 sets of them in different sizes and for different effects. So, I'm not opposed to using these pens just to add those details. They make it a lot easier. In fact, I use it for the calligraphy later on. I use a 0.01 tip for that one, because it was a larger surface area. And these small 0.005 great for smallest things like eyeballs, or if you're writing on scrolls and you really want to, or a book, you really want some control. You can do it with a brush, but you can do it with a pen as well, and it works out pretty well. And there it is, just dotting the eye, and that is after putting that ink in the middle, so it has that iris and then the pupil, just to give it that dimensionality. Alright, time to do that calligraphy. Now, what I did is, again, using a 0.01 pen, I wrote this image like 3 different times on little cardboard pieces. And if you're going to do something like this, I highly recommend that you practice it on a flat surface several times before committing to it onto the miniature itself, because once your hand has muscle memory of exactly how to place it and how it's going to work out, you're just replicating that. So having that muscle memory while doing it. And when it comes to these pens, you have to be ultra careful to not overdo it, because overdoing it is the hugest. Start small and then build that up. See how I do 1, 2, 3 passes, 4 passes, and just darken up every other areas, and that's what you want to do, unless you want to create a super thin line like this one. Done. Okay. Again, practicing it on several surfaces is what helps. In fact, when I practiced it on a flat surface, that eye was actually longer. But noticing that I have very little room, I shortened up the I in the RIP to be able to accommodate that big old swooping P for that, and the swooping R as well. So I actually made it shorter in the middle, and it came out great. So I'm really lucky. See how put it down thinly and then build it up as well. And there you go. If you want to ever add any kind of things, you may want to look at different font styles on your regular word processor and stuff like that, just to get ideas on that. And since I'm not selling this, there's no copyrights. So it's just from entertainment in my game table and for educational purpose to teach you how to do it. So if I do take elements from that, I do so to be able to educate. Okay, time for a swoosh. And I don't know what else to call it other than a swoosh. Over, under, its infinity symbol, and whoop, whoop, done. I want to build that up just a little. Yep, and just tracing it over and through. Just to darken it up so it can be the same dot thickness of the calligraphy as well. And I think that came out great. Pretty cool. Yep, and that's all there is to it for that part. I think it's a very striking feature for the miniature. Time for some Agrax Earth Shade, and I'm just going to build up some tints on the bottom where it might have gotten dirty or anything like that. And if it splatters like it just did, that's fine, because, you know, sometimes mud splatters. It happens, especially when it rains really hard on the tombstone. So I'm not really worried about it. Just I'm worried about the only thing is getting some on the wings. You don't want to do that. So, and you see it's pretty translucent to be able to do it. And again, using wash. I think I ran out of wash actually right there. The PSI is turned up on that just to let the flow come out a little bit better. So I think I turned it up to 20 to 25 PSI when I was doing this. And it used a lot of the the shading. Like it used a lot as far as the amount. Now look at that. It goes from that dark brown into that gray, onto the green on the top, and it really has a great transition throughout. Being that it's a pretty flat surface, and there's devoid of a lot of detail, adding that color variation really starts making it pop. Okay, they use proxy models for the bases. Yep, they're 32mm base this time. Great product here, and it comes it has some texture to it, flat surface, and it dips, but you know, hey, I think it's great, and I think I picked it up on eBay for really cheap. Now time to use some basing material. I do like to use sand, grit, and some people say that it's too large, and I beg to differ on this one, only because of the way that I use it. Time for some kitty litter. It's ballast as well, and I had a problem with this because I went overzealous when it came to the glue. My bad. Whoa, that's way too much. Only because it didn't want to come out of the small tip, and I do have to wash that out at some point. So there's that. I think I should put it in a dishwasher or something. I think I'll do that today at some point. Yipperies. Alright, time for some baking soda. And here's the trick. Using baking soda in the sand kind of makes it, you know, even out. So this way the grit doesn't look so large to an extent. I had some paint in there left over from the shade from when mixing before. And I kind of just like threw that in there. It doesn't matter because it's going to get painted over anyway. So it really has great consistency. And usually I put some water in there. Since I put so much PPA glue, I have to put in some more sand, which I didn't want to do because I didn't want to waste any of that sand there. Not that it's a big deal because I can always get, I have construction sand, which is a lot lumpier grit as well. I kind of wanted to do the fine grit there. Again, adding more ballast just to give it that lumpy texture. And the thing is, when you apply this, it comes out pretty lumpy, which looks like, very worn ground, lumpy, uncared for, unkept ground. Now, so that adds realism to it. Yep. And there it is. Now I use these little sticks from Wood Pile. That's what it's called. And I got those at ACM Moore. I remember that. And I use them for multiple applications. I use it for banding on doors when I create buildings. I use them as, well, applicators for basing right here. I use them to mix things in my airbrush, paint in my airbrush usually, or anything else I throw in there. Yeah, so they have a lot of different uses, these sticks, and they're really good. They're very disposable, so I'm not too worried about it. So there it goes. You're working in as a paste now. I could have used model paste for this, and I have used model paste in the past, but this effect comes out a little more gritty, and I do like it. So it depends on which model I'm using it. I can use modeling paste for this easily. And since it's so thick, it'll hold its shape for the most part. It'll contract just a little bit when drying. And speaking of drying, I tried to dry this with a hair dryer, but then the innards didn't want to dry. So I recommend you wait several hours before applying paint onto this, or let this be your last step for your miniature session and allow it to dry overnight. But before I do that, I'll make sure all the holes are covered and it's very lumpy. What I do is I take road gravel. That's right, folks, road gravel, totally free. And on the side of the road, I look to see if I see any finely grit or finely ground down pieces of road gravel, and I put them in a container. And I've been using that container for years now, and it's a container the same size as the kitty litter container over there, and I have not run out just yet. So, but then again, I use those rocks as accent pieces anyway. So it's really important you don't get any gook or basing materials on the side of the, I like to call it plinth, but the side of the base there, because you got to paint over that. There it is, road gravel. It has different rocks, different textures. There've been little pieces of glass in there as well. And it really adds some realism to it, in my opinion. It breaks up the ground. The ground is basically the ground. And now you have some rocks strewn around, which is excellent. And I put on some, I did put on some leaf litter, but I got it off camera. And like after I took all the pictures from the photo shoot and everything, I thought it needed some leaf litter. So I did add some leaf litter off camera to this, FYI. But there it is with all the stones. And that really makes it look great, in my opinion. One thing I wanted to experiment with, speaking about outside materials, is mulch. I do wanted to try that. You could bake mulch, I think, to get all, any kind of microbes out of it. That might help, but, just be careful because it'll catch on fire. You can boil it. Okay, time for some charred earth, or charred sienna there, charred ground. And this is a new color that I'm introducing here. I think I was going to go to the same color as the wing, but then again it's the ground, so I kind of didn't want to go to that color. And I slowly built it up until it looks like dusty. And then I take some concrete slab, I believe, and I just highlight where the rocks are, just to add a tonal variety to it. So it's all about bringing out different colors and adding visual interest into that base, but not overpowering the senses, where it takes the focus where the focus really needs to be, which is the actual miniature. So adding variation is great. But if you have an awesome base and a mediocre miniature, you're going to pull, your base is going to compete with the tension for the model as well. So you could be looking at the base longer than you actually look at the model, and people say, instead of, hey, great miniature, they say, hey, great base. I've had that happen to me before. It's like, hey, great miniature. And I'm like, oh, hey, thanks. That's awesome. Hey, great base. And I was like, well, what's the miniature's poop now? In my opinion, I don't actually verbalize that for the most part. I'm pretty outspoken mostly. But, I kind of wear my heart on sleeve. In other words, you know exactly where I'm coming from. And I speak frankly. But I try to be somewhat polite at the same time. So I am conscious of that. So I think it came out great. As far as the basing is concerned, as far as the miniature is concerned, here's something cartoony, and I sort of made it a little more realistic, but cartoony at the same time. I kind of preserved this cartooniness with making it more realistic. Alright, time for some WWS spring tufts, which I've cut. Yeah, it's the space is too small for a full tuft, so I kind of cut it with a little bit of scissors, and I added a piece there and a piece in the front. But I noticed that once I cut it, that the actual grass that they used for this did not stand up straight, so I kind of stuck it down, and then I moved the grass over, sort of like combed its hair, as you will, to be able to stand up a little more straight. I even take a little end of a Q-tip and just move it in the opposite direction. There you go. You still want it wild, but at the same time, you don't want it all to flow in one direction, just to create that unity or consistency. Now, one thing with tufts, a lot of people just put once and done, put a tuft in and it's done. I don't like that theory. I kind of want to unify the model. So what I do is I'll take a shade and just darken it down just a little bit. And the reason why I darken it down a little bit, it just brings some of the colors that you're using within the palette range. And just adding it to the base, so this way the tufts doesn't look like it's standing out. Because right now, those tufts are so bright. I mean, it's drawing my attention away from the miniature and to the tufts, which we can't have. And I purposely used a lighter colored because I knew I was going to darken it down with a shade. And I darkened down other tufts before with the shade, and it got really dark. So it kind of looked like the ground or caked mud was on it, which I didn't want to go for here. So I tried for a spring mix instead of an autumn mix when it comes to the WWS Scenics tufts, which I got. Now, they have Army Painter tufts. I just didn't see them available when I went to get them on Amazon. I did see them at PAX Unplug, and I was tempted to get some, but I already have the tufts from WWS. And I am going to keep using these tufts until they run out. And that's when I get the new one. I'm not just going to get and stockpile tufts when I don't need to. Especially in this economy, where you kind of want to just save your money. It's crazy, save your money. But you do want to save your money, and those battle forces during Christmas time, that's tough, man. Yeah, it's tough because those things are awesome. Those things are truly, truly awesome, and I think they're amazing. I'm really liking the Stormcast Eternal. I was actually going to get Blight War, but I changed my mind to getting Blight War. Time for some Dusty Ground, just to add some variance to it. And I'm going to dry brush those rocks. Again, using the same techniques I used before, where you just get one drop, you load a soft brush, and you just void it out. You just keep going back and forth until there isn't any. So look how soft that brush is. It really holds it together. And there it is, just voiding it out, voiding it out, voiding it out, voiding it out, and now ready for dry brush. One precious little on your brush when you dry brush, because these little surfaces will need precious little to be able to pick up its very fine lines and ridges, and that's all you're trying to do with this dry brush. trying to get the fine lines and ridges. So yeah, Tufts at saving money. Those battle forces, man. I'm telling you, Stormcast Eternal is amazing, and I'm really digging the Tau as well because I've always wanted to do the robots. You know, I'll get a robot one of these days. One of these days. I'm focusing on a new camera and better audio for you guys because that's driving me absolutely insane. And DSLR. I'm also thinking about putting some kind of like having a wall of foam or something to be put up, or some kind of sound curtain, so this way the audio quality is better for you guys. I think that would be better as well. And speaking of which, I do a lot of recording in a room, a spare room upstairs, or I'll do it downstairs in the basement. So I think, I'm not sure, I'll just set up a little station possibly downstairs and just encase it into that sound reducing foam so you'd have instant better quality, in my opinion. So I'll definitely look at that as an option for the channel. And it is actually getting pretty expensive. I don't think I'll do the Patreon route unless I get a couple of thousand subscribers, and then I think it's worth it. But I keep investing into this channel because it's a lot of fun for me to share this stuff with you. I really do not like unpainted minis. So if I can show you how to paint your minis to a decent quality, in my opinion, and I could definitely help out the community, that's what the goal of this channel was, to hobby and to share that hobby with you guys. And the fact that you're here is amazing to me. I really do appreciate that you watch the videos and you like the videos and you keep watching the videos, because I'm really nobody with no talent and no skill, and I just really like to do this, and I really have liked to do this for a better part of my life. And it was just me in some small area of room doing this alone, and now I feel like there's a community, so it's all about the community. Speaking of which, community in my area is growing. People are starting to get interested in Age of Sigmar, which I really, really hope that becomes into something. I don't know the rules well enough to play, but I think I'm going to have some play sessions. I'm also going to do some paint lessons in my local gaming store as well, just to show people about the hobby there as well. So, and get rid of all those unpainted minis, because people think it's acceptable to have unpainted minis. I beg to differ. I say, no, man. The whole point of this is to bring them to life so they can look cool. That's, in my opinion. People are statisticians and they get into all that stuff, and that's never my thing. My thing is to be able to create stuff and to make it look cool and to push myself and do something new each time. Well, we're getting to the end of this video, cleaning my brush and being done with it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was very helpful. Thank you. I'll catch you on the flip side. Well, that concludes our painting chat. If you like this video, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time on the miniatures paintbrush.